Chapter 10. Jack Flies. Belief was the solution to all of this. If Jack had learned anything, it was that he just had to believe things would be alright in the end. He had to believe he would find out who he was. He had to believe that he wouldn't be invisible forever. Even when he was at his absolute lowest, he had to believe that he could fix his staff and regain his powers. And that was exactly what he was going to do. He had to believe, once again. So while Jamie was busy in the forge, Jack allowed himself to take a stroll, back into the woods, because the woods always made him feel at home. It didn't exactly look like home, but if he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine he was back in Burgess, or even Hawthorne, or whatever that place was called at this point in time. Jack had asked Baby Tooth to stay with Jamie, because while Gobber seemed trustworthy, if not a little bit eccentric, he was too paranoid to leave him alone without supervision he knew he could trust. Baby Tooth would find him and alert him if anything happened. Villagers had seen him head towards the woods, so he didn't know how long it would take before someone came looking for him. Even if he understood their caution, it was still annoying. He'd already gone through this with the Guardians. Was he bound to be mistrusted by every new group of people he met? At least the Guardians' wariness had been partially Jack's fault. He was a bit reckless and a bit irresponsible, and maybe even a bit rude sometimes, especially towards Bunny, before they became friends. But it wasn't Jack's fault that he and Jamie had appeared here under such mysterious circumstances. Well, at least he hadn't meant for it to happen. He sighed, pushing those thoughts away for now. This wasn't the time to blame himself. For the first time in 3 days, Jack was completely alone. No people, dragons, or tooth fairies to watch over him. Baby Tooth had been there in Antarctica when he regained his powers, but it wasn't like performance anxiety was the problem. No, the problem was that Baby Tooth would probably try to stop him from doing what he was about to do. He retraced his steps back to the cliff Jamie had fallen off of. Tentatively, he inched closer to the edge and looked down. The ocean looked peaceful from here. The sun shone through the dim cloud layer, making the water look somewhere just between beautiful and merciless. Even if Jamie was a good swimmer, he wouldn't have survived the fall from this height. Jack swallowed thickly and decided to move further away from the village, and further away from this place that had already harbored bad feelings. That was the last thing he needed right now. He continued walking until the ground started sloping downwards. He didn't know how far he was from the village now, but far enough to give him room to think. He faced the cliff, looking up at the sky. To his right, the hill winded down towards the water before beginning to slope upwards again. If he wanted to be on the safe side, he could go down there. The fall wasn't lethal, but then there was still the question of what would happen if he went underwater. But that didn't matter. He wasn't going to fall, and he wasn't going to take another unplanned swim. North had told him about the man he used to know before he became a Guardian. How long ago that was, Jack wasn't sure, but the way North talked about it made it seem like 1,000 years ago, and just yesterday at the same time. Jack also didn't know what had become of that man, but according to North, he hadn't been just any ordinary person. He had the power of belief. If he believed in something, it would become real. He would believe it into reality. And so, one day, he went out into a field, closed his eyes, and imagined that his feet left the ground. He imagined that the wind carried him up into the sky, and he believed that it was possible. For all Jack knew, it might just have been a story that North made up, but that didn't seem like North. Besides, all the Guardians knew about the power of belief. If Jack believed he could get his powers back, he could. If he believed he could fly, he could. He just needed to kick himself back into action. Last time, the Guardians and their children had been in danger, and Jack was their only hope, and he just remembered why the moon had chosen him to be a Guardian. That surge of euphoria and the sense of duty had been enough to mend his staff. Now, there was no immediate danger, but Jack had done this once before. He could do it again. He took a deep breath. He kicked off his shoes, giving his bandaged feet a disgruntled look. He looked down to the ocean and slowly exhaled. His heart was speeding up, but he willed himself to stay calm by pacing back and forth, reminding himself that he would be fine. Soon, he'd call back his powers, and he and Jamie would be on their way back to the present. After a couple of minutes, he came to a stop. He looked up to the sky instead of the ocean. That's where he was going. That's where he belonged. He closed his eyes. "Wind," he said. The wind didn't reply, but Jack didn't expect it to. "You probably don't know me, Not yet, anyway, but I know you, and I trust you." The last part came out shaky, and Jack gritted his teeth. He nodded to himself. He did trust the wind. And he trusted himself. He believed in himself. He believed in Jack Frost. The wind picked up. It surged around Jack almost curiously, and Jack felt a smile spread on his lips. His new cloak swayed, the wind pulling it towards the cliff. This was familiar territory. All he had to do was take the leap. Jack stepped forward, his arms spread out to the sides. He jumped. And just then, he was home. He was in the wind, and he was going up. He felt the euphoric tug in his gut he always got whenever he traveled across the world, bringing with him the cold breeze of winter. He was grinning. A laugh was growing in his chest. He'd done it. But then the wind slowed down around him, and Jack opened his eyes. For a quarter of a second, his momentum kept him almost completely still in the air, and then he plummeted straight down. Jack gave a yelp. "Up!" he yelled. "Wind! Wind! Hello!" And then he lost the ability to form words. Panic overtook him, and he flailed, turning around in the air. For a second, he saw the sky, huge and gray above him. He stretched out his hand as if it would reach down and grab him, but then he flipped around again, and all he could see was the cold, dark water. Jack clenched his eyes shut and curled into a ball. He was going to die, again. In the next second, he slammed into something, and everything went dark. Weird thing was, Jack knew what death felt like, and this wasn't it. Confusion mingled with his fear, but he didn't get the time to ask himself what was going on. The darkness shook. Jack felt his brain rattling inside his skull, and then silence. Jack kept his eyes shut. He wasn't sure if he was breathing or not, but he knew he was still alive, somehow. He groaned in pain. His cheek rubbed against the strange surface, hard, warm, and scaly. He opened his eyes, but it didn't do much. Everything was black. But then the cocoon opened up, and Jack realized he was looking straight at a big, scaly dragon stomach. He rolled away in surprise, but didn't try to stand. The world was still spinning. Toothless grumbled, getting to his feet. He shook his body before his huge green eyes turned to Jack. He crooned softly, and Jack swore he sounded worried. Then Jack realized there was a saddle on his back, but no rider. "Jack!" Jack flinched at the sudden voice and turned to see Hiccup half running towards him. His face was muddy, and pine needles stuck out of his hair, but otherwise he looked unharmed. Weird thing was, he was wearing some kind of cape. No, not a cape. Fabric stretched from his arms to his sides, and down to his legs, like a flying squirrel. Hiccup came to kneel in front of Jack, his eyes wide. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Jack couldn't find his voice. It felt like Baby Tooth magic had worn off, because Norse seemed like an impossible language. He looked around and realized they had landed at the base of the hill, where the water was closest. Judging by Toothless's less than elegant landing, it had been a close call. Hadn't the hill sloped down like it did, they would have hit the mountain wall. And judging by the trail in the grass from the crash landing, they almost had. His eyes traveled up the cliff he jumped from, and then down towards the water. Jack felt his chest constrict painfully, and he looked away. His hands were shaking, he noticed. No, his whole body was. Finally, he shook his head. He wasn't planning on meeting Hiccup's eyes, but when Hiccup placed his hands on his shoulders, he looked up in surprise. Hiccup's grip was tight, and his gaze hard. "What were you thinking?" he asked, and Jack almost recoiled at his tone. He sounded beyond shocked. He sounded almost hurt, like he was the disappointed one here. Jack started, but how could he explain? A part of him didn't care. Hiccup already thought he was crazy, so he could just tell him the truth. Crazy was a good cover story, at the very least. Why should he care about what some Viking that, to Jack, had been dead for 1,000 years thought? However, something about the way Hiccup looked at him made Jack keep his mouth shut. Bright green eyes, wide with shock, and a tight grip on Jack's shoulders. Hiccup was genuinely worried. It felt like being shaken from a dream, and Jack realized that he didn't want Hiccup to think he was crazy. But that did the opposite of solving his problem. Jack had no normal explanation for what he'd just done. He was about to shrug and reply, but a realization made his heart leap into his throat. His hands went to the ground beside him, and he looked around frantically. "My staff! Where's my staff?" Hiccup released Jack's shoulders at the sudden distress.
Why do you care about your staff now? He asked.
Jack ignored him. He pushed himself to his feet and looked around, but the staff was nowhere to be seen. But he'd been holding it when he jumped, so then his gaze came to a stop on the water where he would have landed if Toothless hadn't caught him. There, floating out to sea, was the thin silhouette of his staff. Jack walked forward as if to jump into the water, but his body became rigid before he could. He brought a shaky hand to his head.
Is that it over there?
His eyes snapped to Hiccup, and then back to his staff in the water. He tried his best to hide his panic, managing the barest nod. Hiccup looked confused, and Jack really couldn't blame him. It was unusual to react so badly to the loss of what looked like a regular old stick. But Hiccup just nodded and jogged over to Toothless. He unhooked the squirrel wings from his arms and legs, rolled them up and attached them to his back before climbing onto Toothless's saddle.
"Come on, bud,"
Hiccup said, and they took off. Jack felt like the world was lifted off his shoulders when he realized what Hiccup was doing. Of course, dragons. You didn't need to be a spirit to fly around here. Toothless dived and plucked the staff out of the water with his mouth, took a U-turn and landed beside Jack again. Jack automatically held out his hands as Toothless opened his mouth, dropping his staff into his palm.
"Thank you,"
Jack said with a slightly shaky smile, first to Toothless, then to Hiccup. Toothless looked like he was smiling in his own gummy, dragony way. Hiccup dismounted. He didn't say anything, but walked up to the side of Toothless's head, sending Jack an inquisitive look that made Jack shift his weight uncomfortably. He avoided Hiccup's eyes by tentatively patting Toothless's snout. There was a very heavy silence.
"Do you want to talk?"
Hiccup then asked. Jack bit his tongue. "How did you find me?" he asked back.
"By chance,"
Hiccup replied, still with that gravely serious expression. Now that Jack had calmed down a little, he could also see that Hiccup looked paler than usual.
"I was flying with Toothless, and I saw you pacing on that cliff. I almost turned around to pretend I hadn't seen you because I figured maybe you just need some time alone to think, but then—"
His voice, which had been growing in pitch, dropped suddenly. He shook his head. He looked almost accusatory at this point. "I did need some time alone to think," Jack said, tightening his hold on his staff.
"How could you do that?"
Jack took a step back. "What?" Hiccup definitely looked accusing, and a type of frantic Jack didn't understand.
"What about Jamie? You just leave him behind?"
he demanded, throwing his arms out. Jack stared at him. "What are you talking about?" he asked back. Toothless burbled restlessly. There was a moment of doubt in Hiccup's eyes before his frown deepened. Jack realized he actually did look somewhat like his father.
"Don't lie to me, Jack," he said. "Just earlier you told me you were going to believe in yourself, and now this?"
Jack found himself gritting his teeth. For a moment, he forgot that he and Hiccup weren't talking about the same kind of believing in yourself. It was his turn to get angry. "Well, it didn't work out, did it?" he snapped. "Nothing ever does."
"That doesn't mean you can just give up,"
Hiccup protested. He was almost yelling now.
"I told you I wanted to help, Jack. Maybe I don't know exactly what you're going through, but if you just told me you're hurting so much, then—"
He trailed off, like he lost his courage in the middle of the sentence. But it didn't matter. Jack suddenly understood. "Oh," was all he thought to say. When Hiccup sent him a confused look, Jack shook his head. "That's not it, Hiccup," he said softly, feeling himself deflate as the anger seeped out of him. I didn't want to. I'd never do that." Hiccup didn't look convinced, but his expression softened slightly.
"Then what were you doing?"
he asked. When Jack didn't answer, he gestured vaguely with his hands.
"Because if you're in trouble, you're not alone, you know. I mean, the way you answered me earlier, when I said you could have died, you just...
Again, he gestured. He did that a lot, Jack thought.
"What did you mean by that?"
Jack looked away. He couldn't very well tell him. He died once before, and had as a consequence developed a certain gallows humor. "It doesn't matter," he mumbled.
"It does,"
Hiccup protested. Jack sighed, looking back at him exasperatedly. His eyes went to the pine needles in Hiccup's hair. He frowned. "Wait, how did you land when—" he said, looking back to where the squirrel wings had been earlier. Hiccup obviously didn't take the bait, but he humored Jack anyway.
Flight suit, he said, grimacing slightly. I predicted that Toothless wouldn't be able to land on his feet if he was going to catch you first, and that wouldn't have ended well for me. Not the safest solution, but I didn't have much time to come up with another plan. The landing isn't perfect, but it's a work in progress.
Jack nodded slowly. He stepped forward and plucked a pine needle out of Hiccup's hair. Flight suit, huh? He muttered quietly.
Jack,
Hiccup said, and placed a gentle hand on Jack's arm as he lowered it from his hair. Jack stiffened.
I'm worried about you. Please talk to me.
Those words shouldn't be hard to process, and yet they were. Jack's mouth felt dry. Several seconds passed before he managed to look up at Hiccup's eyes again. He pulled his arm away. I told you, he said. You have nothing to worry about. I'm fine.
Even before this I could tell that you're not fine, Hiccup argued.
Could you? Jack snorted.
I'm pretty sure you think I'm crazy. Not very hard to tell.
It looked like he'd hit a spot. Hiccup's steady gaze faltered.
That's not true,
he said, but he hesitated first. Jack smiled lopsidedly. I don't blame you, he said. Maybe it was better that way, too.
I don't think you're crazy,
Hiccup sounded more determined now. Then he hesitated again.
I'll admit I had my suspicions, but believe me, I know what crazy looks like. Ever heard of Dagger the Deranged?
Jack raised his brows. No, he laughed. How do you get a moniker like that? Hiccup's expression revealed there was a long story behind that answer.
Believe me, you don't want to know, he muttered. But my point is, you're nothing like him, or any other less than sane person I've met. You're just...
Weird? Jack offered. Hiccup's mouth was open, but no words came out for the first few seconds.
You said it, not me, he then said.
Jack laughed. An awkward smile was growing on Hiccup's lips as well. Then there was another beat of silence, but it was less heavy this time. Awkward, definitely, but at least Jack didn't feel as much like running away anymore.
Thanks for not calling me crazy then,
Jack said dryly. Hiccup didn't look pale anymore. Instead, his cheeks were turning a bit pink.
Yeah, sorry about that,
he said, brushing some hair out of his face. He shifted his weight, obviously trying to come up with the right words. Jack pressed his lips together. He really was being a pain in the ass, wasn't he? Here was Hiccup, who'd apparently just gone through hell for his village, who wanted to help Jack and Jamie despite the risks, and then he gets the impression Jack wanted to end his own life? Even if that was far from the case, it was hard to explain why he jumped from that cliff in any other way that wasn't the truth. And the truth? Jack swallowed down the painful lump in his throat. Hiccup had distracted him for a few minutes, but the heavy, hopeless feeling in Jack's gut was still there. It felt almost claustrophobic. The more he thought about it, the more he felt like he was drowning.
Jack,
Hiccup started. Jack realized he'd lowered his gaze, but he didn't trust himself to meet Hiccup's eyes at the moment. He looked at Hiccup's hands instead. They were twitching, clenching and unclenching, and Hiccup kept shifting his weight.
I know things are hard for you and Jamie, but while you're here, would it hurt to, make some friends and stuff?
Friends would be nice. Jack knew that. So why was the concept so terrifying?
I mean, one friend, at least,
Hiccup then said, voice soft.
Plus a Night Fury. Isn't that a good deal?
There was still a part of Jack that wanted to run away. Hiccup was kind. If nothing else, he was a nice distraction from everything. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Hiccup just wasn't quite real. Jack was lost in time. To him, Hiccup and everyone on Berg were just like ghosts or memories. And then there was another feeling, which was a lot more familiar. Jack's goal was to travel back to the present with Jamie, and he wouldn't accept any other outcome. In the end, he'd leave Berg in this time era, and he'd never see anyone here ever again. He'd already lost so much. Was there any point in gaining something he knew he'd have to leave behind eventually? But even with those uncertainties, there was still one desire that always, without fail, towered over the others. Jack didn't want to be alone. It wouldn't hurt, no, he eventually replied. Hiccup seemed surprised.
Really?
Jack tried for a smile and looked up to meet his eyes again.
Of course not, he said. I'm just not very, good with people, is all. You're not good with people? Hiccup asked doubtfully. Are you sure about that? Kids are different, Jack said. But that's not what I mean. What do you mean, then? Jack pursed his lips. He looked over at the ocean, weighing his words. It's complicated, was what he settled on. I'm more used to being alone. Hiccup was quiet for a few seconds. Do you like being alone, though? He asked. He was looking at Jack, inquisitive yet empathetic, like he knew what Jack would answer. Jack ignored the uneasy feeling in his chest. He shook his head. Nobody does. Hiccup's expression softened. Then don't be, he said. Talk to me. You don't have to say much if you don't want to, but you shouldn't carry all of this alone. Strange. Jack had wished for company for so long, and now that it was offered to him, he found it hard to accept it. Why did it feel like this just wasn't meant for him? Jack Frost wasn't supposed to have human friends at his own age. Well, physical age, at least. But maybe this time around, Jackson Overland could be different. He glanced up at the sky. The moon was nowhere to be seen, and yet Jack could feel him watching. He didn't know what made him walk over to the edge of the small cliff and sit down, putting his staff down beside himself. He knew the moon had never actually meant any harm, but that didn't mean Jack had completely forgiven him. Especially not now. Part of Jack felt like the man in the moon was playing some kind of game. He didn't trust what would happen if he accepted Hiccup's offer. But by accepting, it also felt like an act of defiance. Whether it was towards the moon, or the time fragment, or the voice in Jack's head that was still convinced he was destined to be alone, he didn't know. Hiccup sat down beside him a few seconds later, and Toothless came to lay down on Jack's other side. I'm not going to try to jump again, if that's what you're worried about, Jack said. Toothless grumbled. Hiccup intertwined his fingers. His prosthetic leg hung off the edge of the cliff, swinging slightly, like he was nervous. I guess you don't want to tell me what you were going to do if you weren't trying to, take a prolonged swim? Jack wrinkled his nose. You wouldn't believe me if I did, he said. I don't know, Hiccup said uncertainly. You could give it a try? Jack smiled faintly, but shook his head. Maybe some other day, he said. It was stupid anyway. I'm already in a bad mood. Hiccup was quiet for a little bit, but he nodded slowly. Astrid seems to like you a lot more, he then said, sending Jack a trying smile. Don't know why. I crashed into her last night. She didn't like me very much then, he said. But if it hadn't been for her help, I don't think I would have been able to save Jamie. Near-death experiences tend to bring people together, Hiccup said. You've had many of those? Oh, they're piling up. He didn't sound too happy about it. I guess the friendships are worth it, though. Jack laughed softly. And you and Astrid? He said, but hesitated when Hiccup sent him a questioning look. I mean, aren't you two? Oh no, Hiccup said, waving his hands a little. We're just friends. I mean, we're close, but yeah. Jack nodded slowly. She's cool, he said. She is, Hiccup agreed. Way out of my league. It's a little intimidating sometimes. Jack laughed. Hiccup looked pleased with himself. He gestured at Jack. And what about you? He asked. Is your life always this confusing, or is this a special case? Oh, that, Jack started darkly. He ran a hand through his hair, wondering how much he could say, or rather, how much he felt like saying. He wouldn't call himself an open person. Solitude did that to you. But still, Hiccup had already proven he valued Jack's comfort and safety. Opening up to him, even just a little bit, was probably worth the risk. That doesn't sound good, Hiccup said, and Jack gave a dry chuckle. No, I guess not, he said, picking up the end of his staff. He traced the patterns in the wood with his fingertips. He tried going through everything he told Hiccup about himself. He and Jamie were brothers. He'd learned to fight by himself. They lived in a village that was visited by traders who had taught them Norse. Jack didn't like to lie, and even if he knew there was no way around it, he'd like to stay as close to the truth as he could. It turned out to be harder than he initially thought. Hiccup seemed to understand. It's all right. You don't have to push yourself, he said. Let's not talk about the hard stuff. Talk about the good stuff. Jack sent him a grateful smile. He took a deep breath and let it out in a sigh. Well, lately I've actually had it very good, he said. Things were hard for a long while. I was mostly alone. He hesitated. People didn't see me. I was no one. Hiccup's lips had parted a little bit. I know what you mean, he said. You do? Jack asked, raising a brow. It probably wasn't true, but Jack would like to hear what Hiccup meant anyway. The son of the chief? Somehow, I found that hard to believe. Oh man, Hiccup said, rolling his eyes. You already heard Gobber call me, well, both of us, actually, a fishbone. Do you think this, he gestured to himself, fared well on an island with barbaric, dragon-killing Vikings? Jack glanced at Toothless, but he closed his eyes and didn't seem to be paying attention. When he looked back, he saw that Hiccup was looking at Toothless as well, wearing a gloomy expression. I mean, Stoic the Vast is my dad. You can guess it was pretty embarrassing for him to have a son like me, Hiccup continued, trying for a small smile. Wasn't good at anything, except drawing and reading. I wanted to be one of them, but every time I tried, I messed up. Everyone thought I was a bother, so nobody bothered to stick around. You felt invisible, Jack concluded. Hiccup nodded before he gave a guilty laugh. So much for talking about the good stuff, he muttered. Sorry, please continue. Jack almost ignored him in order to ask more about Hiccup's background, but he didn't let his curiosity get the best of him. Instead, he bounced off this new information, despite Hiccup asking for the good stuff. I thought I never was important enough, or something, Jack replied slowly. Never one of the big guys. I tried to make the best of it, but he trailed off, biting his tongue. Things were better now, but it seemed it was still hard to talk about. Feelings, not fun. Can I ask you something? Jack looked up. Go ahead, he said. Hiccup was frowning now. Maybe I was imagining it, but you seem a bit uncomfortable with people touching you. Is there a reason for that? Oh, well, Jack started. I'm just not used to it, is all. It's not like I have a problem with it, he smiled faintly. It's nice. Still takes me by surprise sometimes, though. Hiccup looked a little puzzled, but didn't try to push the subject. What happened, though? You said you'd had it good lately. Yeah, Jack said, his smile widening. I found people who needed me. Well, they found me, more like. It's a funny story, actually. I mean, it wasn't funny at the moment. I was actually kind of pissed, because who stuffs people onto backs and throws them through? I mean, he cut himself off, glancing at Hiccup. Hiccup's mouth hung open. They put you in a bag? He whispered, incredulous. Jack raised his hands. Listen, it was sort of a kidnapping, but it's all good now, he said. Hiccup didn't seem convinced, and Jack couldn't blame him. He shook his head with a warm smile. Let's just say I was hard to get a hold of. I wouldn't have come with them if they'd just asked nicely. Sounds like some, friendly people, Hiccup said dryly. Like I said, I was pissed at the time, but trust me, they all have good intentions, Jack said, his voice going quiet at the end. There was a heaviness in his chest, growing the more he thought about the other guardians. Who are they? Hiccup asked, his voice soft. A bunch of morons, Jack replied, before laughing. They're my friends and I love them, but he faltered a little when he realized he'd used the word love. He collected himself before Hiccup could react. But they're still morons, he finished. Hiccup was smiling too. I can relate to that, he said. Having friends who are morons, I mean, not that I'm... Anyway, he brushed his hair distractedly out of his face, and Jack decided not to comment on the dust of pink in his cheeks. Tell me about them. Jack looked at the ocean, conjuring up pictures of the guardians in his mind. Well, first there's the brain behind the kidnapping idea, he said. He's an eccentric person, very big and loud, though his size seems less impressive now that I've seen your dad. He paused, glancing at Hiccup. No offense, he added. None taken, Hiccup said, looking amused. Go on. He's jolly and enthusiastic, Jack said. Maybe a bit too enthusiastic for some people, but we get along plenty. Most of the time, anyway. Can't say I'm not unable to annoy him too, but that's just for fun. You annoy people for fun? Oh, come on. A little mischief never hurt anyone. Hiccup narrowed his eyes, clearly not completely on board. No wonder why you get along with the twins, he muttered, pretending to be exasperated, but there was still a smile on his lips. What's his name? Jack hesitated. I call him North, he said. Jamie calls him Santa. Lots of kids do. He's good with children too, then? Hiccup asked. I sort of met them because we all, work with children, Jack said vaguely. So yeah, kids love him. And the others? There's Tooth, Jack said. She's also very enthusiastic, about Teeth particularly. Predictably, Hiccup's brows knitted. Teeth? Teeth, Jack confirmed. She's a bit strange, but then again, all of them are. Checked out my teeth the first time I met her. It was weird, but anyway, she's very kind and understanding. Then there's Sandy, who's, he's silent. I mean, he never says anything. He uses his hand to speak. Like Goethe? Hiccup asked. Sort of. It's funny, because he looks so mellow and harmless, but he's seriously ruthless if you get on his bad side. You should see him fight. It's pretty terrifying. He laughed. But still, he's a good friend, and he's just as kind as the rest of them. And then, Hiccup tilted his head to the side when Jack got quiet. And then? He prompted gently. You know how you said nobody gets along with Snotlout in the beginning? Jack asked, and Hiccup nodded. Well, that was me with Bunny. Thing is, our jobs sort of cross paths sometimes, and it tends to create some bad feelings. Mostly on Bunny's side. Hiccup sent him a long look. So, Bunny didn't like you at first, you mean? He asked. He said Bunny's name with a bit of an accent, and Jack couldn't help but smile at it. Yeah, he admitted, but then frowned. It's not like it's my fault, though. I'm just doing my job. But he's got to be all like, oh, Jack is so irresponsible, blah, blah, blah. He's so full of himself, you know. Jack rolled his eyes and fell silent. It took him a moment to notice Hiccup looked like he was holding back a laugh. What? Hiccup grinned. Nothing. Go on, he said, though laughter was filtering through his words. Jack stared at him for a few seconds, his cheeks heating up. But Hiccup's amusement was infectious, and Jack couldn't fight the smile growing on his face. It's true, he laughed. He gets annoyed easily, which is fun for me. Sometimes he gets so caught up in his work, and if somebody tries to interrupt, which is usually me, well, let's just say it's not a pretty scene. But it's all right, because he's such a workaholic sometimes. He doesn't realize he needs to have some fun sometimes. And you think annoying him is the way to make him have fun? Hiccup asked, raising a doubtful brow. Listen, I know what I'm doing, all right? Jack said. Sure, he gets a little miffed, but there's no better way to distract him. It's not like I'm making him mad for real, just a little bit to make him focus on wanting to murder me instead of painting his stupid eggs, you know? Hold on, did you say eggs? Jack faltered. Oh, yeah, he paints eggs, he said nonchalantly. He's an artist. Hiccup nodded slowly. Okay, he said. And trying to murder you is fun times for him? Oh, sure. He pretends to be angry, but that's just because he's stubborn, Jack said, rolling his eyes. How do you know that? Hiccup asked. Jack sent him a meaningful look. I know when people are having fun, he said. Hiccup's eyes narrowed slightly, seemingly intrigued, but perhaps a little doubtful of Jack's mastery of the balance between fun and annoying. He was quiet for a few seconds. Jack got the feeling he was being studied. What Hiccup was looking for exactly, he couldn't tell, and he didn't get the time to find out either, because Hiccup seemed to catch his own staring. His green eyes shifted, landing on the ocean instead. So that's North, Tooth, Sandy, and Bunny, Hiccup said, and Jack snickered a little at his pronunciation. And Jamie, of course. What about the rest of your family? Jack blinked. Well, he started. Hiccup immediately understood he'd touched something painful. He opened his mouth as if to apologize, but then closed it like he lost his courage again. But it was fine. He hadn't said anything wrong. Jack just wasn't used to talk about his family with just anyone yet, since he still remembered so little about his past life. Also, He didn't know how to tell the story to someone who didn't know he'd been a spirit for 300 years. Jack started tentatively. I had a mother and a sister. Never had a father, I don't think. He frowned. If he did have a father once, he didn't remember him. Hiccup was quiet. Had? He repeated softly. Jack didn't know what to say, so he just smiled faintly and shrugged. I'm sorry, Hiccup said. It's fine. It was a long time ago. Still, Hiccup laced his fingers, looking down. I never knew my mom, he then said. I haven't lost anyone that close to me before, but I know what not knowing one of your parents is like. It didn't feel like it was the same. If Jack had ever grieved over not having a dad, he couldn't recall the feeling. Hiccup, however, clearly did. What happened? Jack asked. Hiccup grimaced. They say she was eaten by dragons. Jack felt like his chest had just been filled with cold water. Unfortunately, he did know what that felt like. But he looked at Hiccup with awe. You lost your mom to dragons, and you still befriended one of them? He said, glancing at Toothless, who was snoring softly. That's courageous, Hiccup snorted. Quite the opposite, to be honest, he said with a quiet, sheepish chuckle. I just wasn't brave enough to kill them. Well, maybe we have different definitions of courage, Jack said. Then he realized something. He looked curiously at Hiccup. Were you the first to do it? Hiccup's mouth became a thin line before it formed into a sheepish smile. Yeah. Why? Jack prompted. What made you do it? Hiccup's eyes drifted to Toothless' sleeping face, and he shrugged. I had the chance to kill him, but I couldn't. His eyes didn't belong to the vicious beasts I'd always thought they were, so I cut his ropes and he attacked me and... He trailed off, giving an airy laugh. I thought he was trying to kill me, but he spared me. And after that, he shrugged, gesturing at Toothless. Something seemed to be falling into place. Jack turned around to look at Toothless' red tail fin. In the beginning, he just thought it was Hiccup's way to show that Toothless was his by painting his tail fin red. Then he'd realized the tail fin was a prosthetic. He'd also noticed that Hiccup didn't at all act like Toothless was his property. They were friends, equals, even if they weren't the same species. How did he lose his tail fin? Hiccup's expression revealed the answer before he even said anything. I shot him down from the sky, he said, averting his eyes. It was supposed to be my big moment. I was going to prove that I was a Viking by being the first to kill a Night Fury. But you couldn't. We wouldn't be here if I could, Hiccup said with a sigh. Thank the gods. Jack realized he really liked Hiccup. And now you live with them, Jack said. Fly with them. Must be pretty amazing. Hiccup's face brightened. It really is, he agreed. And you found a way to get Toothless to the skies again, Jack said. Toothless' eyes opened at the sound of his name, lifting his head in a silent question. Jack smiled at him and held out his hand. Toothless tilted his head to the side, but let Jack pet his snout. To think that he and Hiccup had started out as enemies, Jack almost couldn't imagine. It was the least I could do, Hiccup said. A downed dragon is a dead dragon. Jack's hand faltered. He let out a silent sigh and let his arm fall. What's it like to fly? He asked, as if he didn't know. That wasn't why he asked. Jack couldn't fly anymore, but at least he could somewhat relive it if Hiccup told him how he experienced it. Hiccup was quiet beside him for a few seconds. Jack almost turned around to see what the matter was, but then he said, Do you want to find out? Jack frowned. Slowly, he turned around. Hiccup was watching him with a hopeful, if not a little nervous, look in his eyes. What happened with not trusting me? Jack asked. You heard what I told Jamie? Hiccup said. Jack stared at him, his heart beating faster. You'll get in trouble, he said. Only if we get caught, Hiccup countered. Jack began to grin. I like the way you're thinking, he said. Never took you for a rebel. You clearly don't know me, Hiccup replied, not with an unnoticeable tinge of smugness. I'm starting to feel like I want to, Jack said. There was a small pause. This time, the silence was filled with anticipation. Hiccup got to his feet. Toothless, he said, You rested up yet, buddy?
Jack didn't get how Toothless understood, but he got up immediately with an expectant expression, like Abby did when Jamie asked if she wanted to go for a walk. Hiccup held out his hand to Jack, and Jack took it, letting himself get hoisted to his feet.
Jack, Hiccup said, where are your shoes?
Oh, those, Jack said, looking down at his bandaged feet, and then up to the cliff he just jumped off earlier. Up there. Hiccup opened his mouth as if to say something, but then just shook his head and walked over to Toothless. After hopping onto Toothless's back, he held out a hand to Jack. Toothless looked at him as well, the gummy smile of his filled with anticipation. Jack could do nothing but grin back. He took Hiccup's hand, seating himself behind him.
Ready?
Hiccup asked. Jack was surprised to feel a tinge of nervousness in his chest. He guessed it was different to take to the skies now that he wouldn't be able to save himself if he fell. This must be how Bunny felt when they boarded North's sleigh. Yeah, he said. He didn't know where to put his hands, and awkwardly put one on Hiccup's shoulder. The other was holding the staff, which might become problematic, but there was no way Jack was leaving it behind. Thankfully, Hiccup didn't question it.
All right, but you heard him, Hiccup said.
Toothless burbled happily. His wings spread out, and Jack's heart sped up. Then he took a leap off the edge and beat his wings. Jack almost expected them to fall, but immediately they shot towards the sky. He gasped as the wind whipped against them. A feeling like electricity ran through his body. It had only been 3 days, and yet it felt like a lifetime since he had sped towards the clouds like this. Hiccup was heading for the cliff to get Jack's shoes, but Jack tightened his grip on Hiccup's shoulder.
No, he said. Forget them. We'll get the shoes later. What? Why? They're right there. I don't want them, Jack said with a laugh.
He straightened his legs, closing his eyes.
It's better like this. It's cold, you know.
I can deal with cold, he said.
Just go higher. Come on.
Toothless seemed to make the choice before Hiccup did, because Hiccup gave a small yelp when their course changed, becoming steeper and faster as they soared towards the clouds. Jack's arms instinctively moved to cling around Hiccup's chest, and Hiccup barely avoided getting hit in the face with Jack's staff. Yeah, flying was definitely scarier when Jack wasn't in control. He almost felt bad for messing with Bunny back then. Almost.
Careful, Toothless, Hiccup said, glancing back at Jack.
It's okay, Jack promised, looking over the side. The ground was getting further and further away, and Toothless was heading out towards the ocean. The clouds were getting closer too. He felt every beat of Toothless's wings like a jolt through his body. Every movement of his muscles made Jack keenly aware that he was sitting atop a living creature that could choose to drop him at any moment. It was a whole new kind of flying, and Jack loved every second of it. His cheeks hurt from grinning so much.
Higher,
he ordered happily. Hiccup let out a surprised laugh.
You know, most people tend to be a little more nervous the first time they ride a dragon, he said.
I'm not most people, Jack replied easily. You should know that by now.
Yet you keep surprising.
Jack's face hurt from smiling. Wouldn't be any fun otherwise, he said. The temperature kept dropping as they got closer to the cloud layer, and then the world turned white. Jack closed his eyes, breathing in the crisp, cold air. He still clung to Hiccup, because gravity would pull him backwards of Toothless if he let go. That still didn't mean Jack didn't have to use all his willpower not to let go and spread his arms out to the wind. In the moment, he couldn't even remember the feeling of falling after jumping from the cliff. In the moment, he was still Jack Frost. All he had to do was let go, and he would be himself again. They broke through the clouds, and sunshine washed over them. Toothless evened out, and they soared serenely through a kingdom of fluffy, towering mountains and spires, painted orange and pink in the afternoon sun. A shaky breath escaped Jack, a painful jolt of yearning mixed with his euphoria. His hands quivered as he let go of Hiccup and raised his arms to the sky. If his sight became a little blurry, he blamed it on the wind.
You okay?
Hiccup asked. It was easier to hear him now that Toothless was just gliding, and the wind was no longer thundering in their ears. Jack didn't immediately answer. Yeah, he then murmured.
What's your verdict, then?
What? Hiccup turned around, looking at him sideways. His expression was kind, if not a little worried.
Flying, he said. How does it feel?
Jack looked back at him and couldn't stop the laughter. It was a little bit shaky. He let his arms fall. He started, but it was hard to decide.
It felt like home. It felt like freedom. In some ways, it felt like safety, even if it certainly wasn't the safest hobby you could have. Jack took a deep breath. I'm where I belong. Hiccup's smile widened, and Jack grinned back at him. The clouds disappeared under them, and they were flying over the glittering ocean. Berg was far behind them, and Jack could see smaller islands scattered in the blue, strangely shaped sea stacks rising out of the water, and, just for a moment, something slithering in the waves and then disappearing into the deep again. Jack shivered. What kind of world was this? Toothless, Jack said, how fast can you go? He swore Toothless side-eyed him like that was a dangerous question. You should hold on, Hiccup said. Jack didn't ask. He hooked his arms around Hiccup again, careful with his staff this time. Hiccup leaned forward, gripping onto the saddle, and then did something with his foot. There was the sound of metal against metal, and Toothless dived. Jack thought he heard someone screech. It might have been himself. His voice caught in his throat as they plummeted towards the ocean, and he tightened his grip on Hiccup, feeling himself get lifted off the saddle. Then Toothless made a sharp turn. Water exploded around them, and they shot forward. They were approaching the towering sea stacks, and Jack almost closed his eyes, halfway convinced they were going to crash, but Toothless zigzagged between them like it was nothing, and then they were heading upwards again. Jack yelped as Toothless spun in the air. They were upside down for a second, and then soaring downwards. Jack had snuck into a roller coaster once or twice in his life, but there was nothing compared to this. All too soon, Toothless slowed down again, and they were high in the sky. Jack only realized he was giggling like a crazy person when Hiccup sent him an amused grin. Fast? He asked smugly. Jack dried his eyes. Fast, he agreed. Toothless made a strange sound from deep in his chest, like he was laughing. Oh man, Jack muttered airily. Have you ever fallen off? Oh, lots of times, Hiccup said. Jack raised a brow. And you use your flight suit to save yourself? Toothless grumbled. The flight suit is a fairly new invention, Hiccup said. Here have been many close calls, but as you know, Toothless is fast, and I guess the gods must be looking out for us, because luck has saved us more times than I can count. Jack had an idea. So, Toothless can catch you if you fall? He asked. Well, there's the problem with flying on his own, so some falls are more dangerous than others. So if I were to fall, Toothless would have been able to catch you, but don't worry, you won't fall, Hiccup said, turning halfway around with a reassuring smile. We know what we're doing. Jack grinned impishly. In that case, he said, and let go of Hiccup. Catch me! He slid off Toothless with a whoop. What, Jack! Was all he heard Hiccup shriek before the wind thundered in his ears again. Jack spread his arms and legs, holding his staff tightly in his hand. His new cloak fluttered wildly around him. He flailed and turned around in the air to look up, moving with the ease of one who had done this 1,000 times before. Toothless and Hiccup were diving towards him, but once they had caught up, Jack wasn't yanked out of his free fall like he expected. Toothless just fell alongside him and smiled with his tongue flapping in the wind. Jack cackled. This is awesome! He roared. Toothless roared too, before he turned and grabbed Jack by his legs. He changed course just in time. Jack's fingertips almost touched the water before they soared upwards again. Hiccup leaned to the side to give Jack a look that was as impressed as it was exasperated. I take it back, he said. You really are crazy. Jack laughed again, and then yelped as Toothless did a sudden flip. He didn't register how, but in the next moment he was in the air, and then he landed on his stomach on top of Toothless's head. Jack burst out laughing and grabbed onto Jack before he could slide off again. With their course steady, Jack held onto Hiccup and carefully crawled onto Toothless's saddle, crouching right in front of Hiccup with a wide grin. That was fun, he said. Get behind me, you lunatic, Hiccup laughed. It was a bit difficult, but he managed to climb around Hiccup and sit back down behind him. As much as he wanted to fly on his own again, or rather fall on his own, he let himself enjoy the rest of the ride without giving Hiccup and Toothless any more heart attacks. By the time they were heading back to the cliff to get Jack's shoes, the sun had begun to set. The closer they got to the ground, the heavier Jack's chest felt. He didn't want to stop flying. They'd probably been up there at least an hour, maybe more, but it felt like the blink of an eye. Maybe it was because Jack was having so much fun, Or maybe it was because an hour was a second for someone who had lived as long as Jack had. Either way, the heavy feeling spread to his throat when they landed on the cliff and became painful. It was dumb. He felt like a child throwing a fit because he didn't get his way. Hiccup dismounted Toothless, and Jack followed. "Oh, I am hungry," Hiccup muttered, patting his stomach. "What about you, Jack?" Jack ignored him in favor of walking up to Toothless. Toothless perked up when Jack stopped in front of him. "Thank you," he whispered. Toothless tilted his head to the side, then headbutted Jack playfully. Jack giggled before turning his attention to Hiccup. Hiccup was frowning at him. Are you okay?" he asked worriedly. Jack blinked. "Huh? Oh." He wiped a tear off his cheek. "Yeah, just the wind," he lied and smiled at him. "That was incredible, Hiccup. Thanks for breaking the rules for me." Hiccup didn't look convinced, but he shrugged, offering a modest smile. "No problem," he said, then hesitated. "It's not the first time I've done it, and it doesn't have to be the last, and by that I mean, what my dad doesn't know won't hurt him, right?" Jack almost laughed at how sheepish Hiccup sounded. Hiccup pressed his lips together. "I mean, I'm saying if you want to fly again..." "I know what you mean," Jack beamed at him. "Of course I want to fly again. Just try not to get caught." Hiccup shrugged. "I'll keep my mouth shut if you do." "Good. I'm great at keeping secrets," Jack said. Hiccup's lips parted, his eyes narrowing into a silent question. Jack winked, then turned around to slip his feet into his boots, letting Hiccup ponder over that statement. "Jack?" "Do you want to join us for dinner?" Jack blinked and turned around. Hiccup had moved over to Toothless's side and was absent-mindedly stroking the dragon's neck, tracing the black scales with his fingertips. "Dinner with Vikings," Jack mused, tapping his fingers against the staff. "Now that sounds interesting." Hiccup smiled. "I'll try to keep them civilized," he promised. Jack snorted, keyword being dry, he said. "What's for dinner?" It was answer enough. Hiccup's face visibly brightened, even if he tried to act subtle about it. He nodded for them to start walking back the way Jack had come from, towards the village. "Probably something tasteless, but who knows? Maybe we're lucky today." "Oh, good. I can't wait," Jack said with another laugh, and they headed back to the village together.